The Mummy, the Will, and the Crypt by John Bellairs, Chapter 10. It is an old book. It's almost 33 years old, and the glue is falling apart. Later that same day, when Grandma and Grandma got back from the hospital, they told Johnny that the checkup had gone okay, everything was all right. Johnny did not believe them for a minute. He was convinced they were faking, and so quickly and secretly as the November days passed, Johnny got ready to put his plan into action. He went to the railroad station and asked the station master about trains that ran up into the White Mountains. He found there was a Boston and Maine train that stopped in Kankamangas Center twice a day, early in the morning and then again late at night. The late train, which left Dustin Heights at 5 p.m., was the one Johnny wanted. He would duck out of the house around 4:30, catch the train, and be far away before anyone knew he was missing. Then there was the matter of money. He would need to pay for the train ticket and for his hotel room, although Johnny didn't have any money stashed away. He knew that his grandparents did. They had lived through the Depression of the 1930s, when the banks had failed, and they'd never gotten over their distrust of banks, so they kept most of their savings on top of the kitchen cupboard inside a red Prince Albert tobacco can. It wasn't much, about $100 in small bills. Johnny felt very bad about taking it, but he told himself that it was the only way. To keep Grandpa from getting suspicious, he decided to leave the money where it was until the day came when, suddenly, he would leave. Johnny also replaced the batteries in his old beat-up flashlight and started picking out the clothes he would need. He'd want all his warm winter things. That was for sure. His parka, his stocking cap, his leather gloves, and his woolen muffler. New Hampshire could turn into a real icebox, and according to the weather reports, there had already been snow up in the northern counties. He wondered what the chapel in the old gloomy mansion would look like in the winter. With a little thrill and a little nervousness, he realized that he would soon be finding out. When was he leaving? For a while, he himself wasn't sure, but then he decided on November 15th for no special reason, since it was coming up soon. He stepped up his preparations and through it all, he hugged his secret tightly to him, like a miser with a bag of gold, terribly afraid that somebody would find out what he was up to and try to stop him. On the morning of November 14th, Johnny woke up and found that he had a cold. He felt feverish and achy, and his head was all stuffed up. Johnny groaned. He wanted to be in top shape for the expedition. Should he postpone it then? Wouldn't it be better to wait till he was really ready? He wavered and fussed all through breakfast, on his way to school, and during school, too. The more he thought, the more convinced he became that he should wait till he was feeling better. But on the other hand, Grandma could be dying. Time was important. At 3:30 when school let out, he had still not reached a decision. On his way home, Johnny stopped by the library. He wanted to look at the book that contained the article about the Glomus estate. He headed straight into the stacks, took the book down, went to a table, and opened it up. The first time Johnny had read it, the article hadn't really sunk in, but this time it made an unforgettable impression. Once again, he read that the mansion was adorned with statues of the 9 worthies, whoever they were. The chapel was a replica of a 17th-century English chapel built by an English nobleman named Sir Robert Shirley. His estate was called Staunton Harold, which was where Glomus got the name from. And then Johnny noticed something new, an inscription over the doorway of Glomus's chapel in honor of Sir Robert Shirley, just as there was over the doorway of the original chapel. At the bottom of the page, there was an enlarged version of this inscription, so it could be easily read. Johnny had studied it before, but he had only half understood it. Now he read it again. Suddenly, it was as if a light had gone off in his brain. Another part of the puzzle was, maybe, solved. "Wow!" Johnny exclaimed. He slammed the book shut and got a loud "shh" from the librarian. Normally, he would have been embarrassed, but right now, nothing mattered except the lost will. He was closer to it than ever. Well, that settled it. He would go tomorrow evening as he had planned, and he would find it. The evening went by quickly, with dinner, dishes, and homework. After everybody had gone to bed, Johnny got up and started packing his battered cardboard suitcase. He threw in clothes and the big screwdriver from the tool chest in the basement. Then he went downstairs to the kitchen, climbed up on a chair, took down the Prince Albert can, and counted out the money. Johnny still felt very bad about doing that, but he believed it was the only way he could save Grandma's life. With a heavy heart, he went back upstairs to finish his packing. The next morning, when Johnny looked out the window, he saw that it was going to be a bright sunny day. In the sky was a flock of those little gray clouds that have dark bottoms. They always reminded Johnny of boats and made him think of travel. Downstairs at breakfast, he heard on the radio that the big snowstorm of the winter was sweeping down out of Canada. It would be snowing hard in the White Mountains area by that night. That might put a cramp in things. But then, weather reports were often wrong. The professor was always saying that. Johnny went hastily over his plans in his mind. He would have to sneak out of the house with his suitcase about half an hour before the train came. Then he would have to hike across town to the railroad station. Should he leave a note of some kind? He'd better, or Grandma and Grandma would think he'd thrown himself into the Merrimack River. "So what's on your mind besides hair, huh?" This was Grandma, who was sitting across from Johnny, munching toast and drinking coffee. Johnny looked up alarmed. "Oh, nothing, Grandma," he said quickly. "I was just worrying about my Latin test." Grandma snorted. You can thank your stars. That's all you've got to worry about," she grumbled. "I have to go back to the hospital for more of them crazy tests. This time it's that hospital over in Amesbury. What's its name now, Henry?" "Bon Secours," he said after thinking a second. "French name. Dunno what it means, though. We won't be back till after dinner time, Johnny. Grandma made some sandwiches and put 'em in the icebox for you." Johnny looked at Grandpa and Grandma. He felt like crying. They were so nice to him, so kind, and here he was running out on them. And then, and with the money out of the can on top of everything else. They would feel awful when they found out he was gone. How could he tell them he was doing it all for Grandma? Johnny went off to school, and the day passed like some sort of strange dream. He felt that everybody was looking at him. Sister Mary Anthony and all the kids knew what he was up to. Finally, when he walked down the stone steps and out into the sunlight at 3:15, Johnny found that he was getting cold feet. He really didn't want to go. It would be so easy just to head home, unpack his suitcase, and relax. Johnny sighed wearily. Yes, that was what he would do, call the whole stupid thing off. As he walked home, Johnny felt better. A great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He ran quickly up the steps to his house and across the porch and opened the front door. On the kitchen floor lay the day's mail. It must have arrived after Grandma and Grandpa had left. As Johnny bent over to pick up the letters, he stiffened. He could see the return address on the business-like envelope that was lying on top of the heap. Dingby and Coughlin, undertakers. Johnny's heart began to pound. He knew what this meant. Grandma was getting ready for her own funeral. She was a very practical, no-nonsense sort of person, and it was just like her to plan the whole business beforehand. A choking sob rose in Johnny's throat. He couldn't stand by and let something like this happen. The best brain surgeon in the world would be at her side soon, if John Michael Dixon had anything to say about it. Up the stairs he galloped. He tore open the door of his room and then, panting, forced himself to calm down. It was only 20 minutes to 4. He had lots of time. First, he opened the top drawer of his bureau. Inside lay the wad of bills from the Prince Albert can with the rubber band around it. Next to it was a brass waterproof matchbox with an enameled inset of an Indian's head against the background of a large white star on the lid. This was the lucky matchbox Professor Childermass had given to Johnny. The professor had carried it all through World War I, and it had come out with only one small injury. If I ever needed luck, I need it now, thought Johnny, and he stuck the matchbox in his pocket. He put $30 in his wallet and stuffed the rest into his suitcase, which he dragged out, all packed from under his bed. He checked its contents once more, then ran downstairs to the basement and came back with an old rusty iron crowbar. After that was packed too. He ran back downstairs to eat the sandwiches they had left for him. Roast beef with mustard and mayonnaise. Normally, this would have been a real treat, but Johnny's nose was stuffed up and everything tasted funny. Oh well, it was food and he was hungry. He wolfed them down, drank a glass of milk, and then headed upstairs again. He sat down at his desk and wrote the following note. Dear Grandma and Grandpa, I have to do something very important. It is a life or death matter, and it can't wait. I'll be back in a few days, so don't worry, don't be angry, please. I'll explain everything later. Sincerely yours, John. P.S. I'm sorry I can't tell you where I'm going. It must remain a secret. Sadly, Johnny took the note downstairs and left it under the sugar bowl. For the last time, he tramped back upstairs to his room. With his suitcase in hand and a lump in his throat, he wondered where he would see it again. Or he wondered when he would see it again. Then, quickly he turned, marched out the door, and down the stairs. His suitcase banged against the banister as he went. Though Johnny's face was pale and drawn, he looked incredibly determined. He also looked scared. Professor Childermass had not seen Johnny for a while, and for a good reason. He had been out in Springfield, in the western part of the state, attending his brother's funeral. Having arrived back in Dunstan Heights on the evening of the 14th, dead tired and in a foul mood, he had not wanted to see anyone, but now, 24 hours after his return, he was anxious to play a few tough, hard-fought games of chess with Johnny. After fixing an early dinner, he drove up to the candy shop in New Hampshire and bought a pound of dark chocolate creams. They were for Grandma, who loved them, and roared back down Route 125 toward Dunstan Heights. He pulled up in front of the Dixons' house at just about the time that Johnny was buying his ticket at the railroad station. The professor jumped out of the car, whistling a jaunty tune. With the candy box in his hand, he trotted up the front walk, mounted the steps, threw open the screen door, and marched quickly across the porch. There was a bell, but he preferred to bang on the door with his fist. No answer. He hammered some more and finally, in desperation, pushed the bell button. Still no answer. "Bah! Phooey!" he said, and started back across the porch. But just then he heard the sound of a motor, saw a flash of headlights, and turned toward the Dixons' car coming into the driveway. "Ah!" said the professor, grinning as he ran down the steps to meet his friends. Grandpa rolled down the window and peered out. "That you, Rod?" he called. "It is indeed," intoned the professor. "Why, who did you think I'd be, the Grand Master of the Knights of St. John? And I was just about to give up on you folks and go home. By the way, where's John?" Grandpa looked puzzled. "Huh? You mean he's not in the house?" The professor scowled. "Well, he may be in the bathroom or hiding in the coal cellar, but I am not in the habit of barging into my friends' houses when no one answers the door. Now then, as soon as you folks can pry yourselves out of your car, let's go in and see if he's anywhere on the premises." A few minutes later, Grandma, Grandpa, and the professor were huddled around the dining room table. Grandma was shaking her head, and she was starting to cry. Grandpa looked stunned. The flesh of his face sagged, and he seemed very old. The professor, who was standing across the table from Grandpa, was holding the note in his trembling hand. The muscle in the corner of his mouth had begun to twitch. Suddenly he threw the note onto the middle of the table. "We have got to stay calm. Let's stay calm, for God's sakes," he roared. And to show how calm he was, the professor pounded both fists on the table. The sugar bowl jumped and came down on its side, spilling sugar everywhere. "Where on earth can he have gone? This is not like him at all. Oh, John, I thought you were so level-headed and reasonable. Judgment, thou art led to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason. Oh, God, God, God!" Ranting and raving in this way, the professor paced up and down the dining room. Grandpa kept staring vacantly into space while Grandma cried silently. Finally, the professor stopped and planted himself next to Grandpa. "Henry, you must have some idea where he has gone." Grandpa turned slowly to face the professor, his cheeks wet with tears. As soon as he saw Grandpa's face, the professor's attitude changed. He winced, sank down into a chair, and put his head in his hands. "I'm a cranky old man," he said, quietly through his fingers. "Now, forgive me. Please forgive me. Now we must keep our heads and try to figure out where he is." He drew a shuddering breath and wiped his hands over his face. "All right, he can't have gone to Korea to look for his dad, so we can eliminate that possibility. I assume he hasn't got enough money to go far. Henry, how much allowance do you give him?" $1 a week, said Grandpa wearily. "I wish we could give him more than that, but..." His voice trailed away. A thought had just struck him. "Oh, dear," he exclaimed, clapping his hand to his forehead. "You don't think..." While the professor was watching, Grandpa went out to the kitchen. There was a sound of scuffling and bumping, and then he came back with the Prince Albert can. He dumped it upside down on the table. It was empty. $100, he gasped. "He took the whole thing. He took the whole darn thing. I can't believe it." Grandma blew her nose loudly and looked up. "I bet I know what happened," she said in a voice thick with crying. "Some burglar probably broke in and made Johnny give him the money. Then he held a gun to Johnny's head and made him write that note. And then he kidnapped Johnny." The professor gazed skeptically at Grandma. "Madam," he said solemnly, "not to insult you, but your house is not the sort that would be selected by a burglar, unless that burglar was a nitwit." The professor scratched his nose and gazed abstractedly at the window. Then he snatched the note and read it again. And that is where we will pause.